Hey everybody, welcome to Heavy on Steelers. I'm Allison Koehler, and I'm joined today by our special guest, Heavy on Sports, senior NFL reporter Matt Lombardo. Matt's covered the Eagles and Giants beats for NJ.com and comes to Heavy from Fansided, where he spent 2 years as their national NFL insider. Welcome, Matt, and thanks for joining us today.
Allison, happy to be here. And the Steelers are certainly one of the more, in my opinion, interesting teams because they have a roster that has a lot of pieces that you can make an argument that they could compete this year, but a lot of big holes as well in what might wind up being the most competitive division in the NFL. So, certainly a lot to get into today, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a lot has changed definitely for the AFC North because typically for the past several years since basically Ben Roethlisberger was around, the Steelers have always been just immediate contenders, and this year it's kind of the tides are turning, and it seems like they've really got a battle to stay competitive in the AFC North. So we'll see what happens. Starting Saturday with the first preseason game.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And there's so much uncertainty still about the quarterback position. I mean, you brought up Ben Roethlisberger, and obviously going into this year, all of the uncertainty about whether it'll be Mitchell Trubisky, who at the time was viewed as one of the bigger free agent signings at the quarterback position. And then you have the hometown kid in Kenny Pickett, and of course, Mason Rudolph still in the fold as well. And this is all in the backdrop of an AFC North where the Baltimore Ravens have a legitimate argument after that draft and getting Lamar Jackson back that they could be one of those worst to first teams in the NFL. Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and the reigning AFC champion Bengals, they're not going anywhere either. And oh, by the way, the Browns have a loaded roster too, and after at least 6 games, Deshaun Watson will be back. So, it's going to be a kind of different Pittsburgh Steelers season than I think fans are used to. But I think there's a lot of storylines abound for this team and certainly that division.
Yeah, we've definitely been a spoiled lot in terms of the quarterback position, but it's going to be definitely interesting to see. But they got to figure it out, like you said. The Bengals have Burrow, the Ravens have Lamar Jackson, and this is going to be for the next decade plus. So the Steelers really have to figure out, what's going on, and the sooner the better, for sure.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. And you can make the argument that if it's close, if they get to the end of the third preseason game, the end of training camp, and Mitchell Trubisky is up here, and Kenny Pickett is here, you can make the argument you should go with the kid. They should get him some real snaps, get him into live game action as soon as possible. Because if you believe enough in him that he is a first round pick, even during a down and coming from a down quarterback class, to me, unless the gap is significant with the talent they have at the skill positions around him, I'd make the argument the sooner you get him on the field, the better, because you can evaluate quicker whether he's your answer long term. He certainly, to me, has more upside than a Mitchell Trubisky does, especially playing in the Pittsburgh market where the weather can get unpredictable late in the year. He has experience doing that from playing at Pitt. I don't know that Mitchell Trubisky is going to thrive in the wind and the snow and the rain coming off the confluence of the three rivers at the stadium.
Yeah.
I just think that if it's close, Mike Tomlin will be doing himself a disservice if they don't go with Kenny Pickett.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely the weather there can be very frigid. Even though Trubisky played in Chicago, there's nothing like you said. There's nothing like the wind and the cold coming off the three rivers there at the convergence of the rivers. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do in cold weather. But going back to Mitch Trubisky, if he plays out his 2-year contract as a Steelers starter that he currently has, do you see Kenny Pickett as a wasted draft pick?
I don't think so. I don't think in the NFL you can ever waste a draft pick on a quarterback because if Mitchell Trubisky can hold off Kenny Pickett, who you drafted in the first round, then obviously things are going way better than expected for Pittsburgh, right? If that's the case, if he's the starting quarterback 2 years from now, or at least going into next year, I think that shows you that he was good enough to put them in a position to compete for the postseason. And you look at Kenny Pickett, injuries happen across the NFL all the time, especially at the quarterback position. Deshaun Watson is certainly an extreme case when it comes to a suspension, but teams are always looking for quarterback help this time of year. So somebody always gets hurt. The name that jumps to mind is the Teddy Bridgewater injury, a decade ago or whatever it was, and you have Sam Bradford getting traded a couple of days before the regular season starts. The Steelers are in a position to benefit there with a first-round pedigree quarterback as a trade chip if it doesn't work out with him as the starting quarterback, and you can kind of worry about getting a franchise quarterback later on, because I don't think that Mitchell Trubisky is the long-term solution. But if he's playing well enough to be the starter for 2 years, that gives you some options on what to do with Kenny Pickett. But you're always better off having that first-round pick quarterback than not having him. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. And speaking of trading, as for, Mason Rudolph, he's sort of proved, Steelers fans have a love-hate relationship with Mason Rudolph. Some fans want to see him get a legit start, a legit opportunity to start without being under the thumb of Ben Roethlisberger. Some people, like myself, I'll admit, I've seen enough. You know what I mean? Like, he's had plenty of opportunities to kind of prove that he can take the reins from Ben Roethlisberger, and has kind of not really done all that great. So I just wonder, being that he's proved to be not much more than a serviceable backup in Pittsburgh, do you see the Steelers keeping him this season, or do you see them maybe putting him on the trading block?
Yeah, I think that if anybody calls on Mason Rudolph and offers even a fifth-round pick for Mason Rudolph, I would think the Steelers would have to entertain that offer, right? Because I don't, barring him having an electrifying preseason and outplaying Mitchell Trubisky and making a strong case for being the starting quarterback this year, I don't see the upside for the Steelers holding Mason Rudolph. Most teams don't carry three quarterbacks on their active roster, especially when they have a veteran starter, which Mitchell Trubisky would be. Once the Jimmy Garoppolo domino eventually falls, whether he winds up in Seattle or in Cleveland, or where there's an injury in the next couple of weeks, Mason Rudolph might be that next name on the quarterback market for teams that are looking for a solid veteran backup, or someone to be a starting quarterback in a pinch because they don't believe in the backup quarterback to have on their roster. But I have a hard time believing, Allison, that unless he becomes the starting quarterback week one, that Mason Rudolph will be wearing a Steelers uniform come September.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And going to the receivers, the receiving end of the ball, George Pickens, the rookie, I mean, he's had an absolute monster training camp. Obviously just training camp, but there's, he's putting on these highlight reels that everybody is super impressed. So I wonder, regardless of which quarterback is under center, what kind of impact do you see Pickens having this season?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the catch that he made the other day where he kind of tipped it with one hand up in the air and then caught it. I thought that was unbelievable. You see him getting behind the secondary a handful of times. It's a really good secondary when you got guys like Terrell Edmonds and Minkah Fitzpatrick back there at safety, and he's beating them in camp and beating them pretty consistently. Just the latest receiver in a long line of wide receivers drafted by the Steelers, who have just become incredible, in my opinion, of finding guys in rounds 2 through 4 or 2 through 5 and turning them into high-end starting wide receivers. So I look at George Pickens. I think he's the deep threat. I think could potentially be an upgrade over what they wanted Juju Smith-Schuster to be in this system. And you look at that trio, and this is why, whether it's Trubisky or whether it is Kenny Pickett, I have a hard time ruling Pittsburgh out, because you look at that wide receiver trio: Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, George Pickens. If Pickens makes an immediate impact and he catches, 55 balls for 850 yards and 4 or 5 touchdowns, that's a pretty good rookie year. And he might even be better than that, depending on the quarterback play. And I think that that's where, if you're the Steelers, you have to be optimistic, regardless of who the quarterback is, because of all of the weapons that they've built around them.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the Steelers just seem to be this constant, wide receiver creating factory. And obviously that was under Kevin Colbert, but, we all know the scouts do all the work. You know what I mean? So hopefully if their scout team is still in place, they'll still be pretty good at drafting those wide receivers. So
yeah, for sure. And I think there's also a little bit of an issue there when you think about they just signed Deontay Johnson. And I thought that was a really smart deal on his part, not going for the full 4-year contract. And, I talked to a couple agents who represent wide receivers around the league, and they basically told me the reason that happened was, number one, you don't want to get locked into an uncertain quarterback situation, which the Steelers have, so that when you're going for that next deal, if you're not putting your best foot forward, if you're not being as productive and prolific as you believe you can be, this speeds up getting to the market again, where you can cash in on another contract still in the prime of your career. So I think that the deal that Deontay Johnson took with the Steelers sets him up really well. And it might just continue this cycle of the Steelers drafting guys, getting the most out of them, and then they cash in elsewhere because they've just become a wide receiver factory. We'll see if the new regime can keep that up.
Right. And the guys that are gonna, help the wide receivers and help the quarterback, of course, is the offensive line, which they revamped this offseason. They added James Daniels and Mason Cole, who will play at right guard and center, respectively. But the Steelers seem to have issues at left guard with Kevin Dotson and Kendrick Green, as well as at the tackle positions. Do you see or hear the Steelers making any more additions on the offensive line, whether it's via free agency or trade before the season starts?
They asked around a little bit about this today, actually, Allison, and it seems like a lot of teams have kind of gone quiet over the last couple of days because there's going to be a round of cuts. The roster gets trimmed to 85. I believe it is on the 16th, so it's coming up here. You have a week of preseason games before that. I think the Steelers and a lot of other teams are kind of taking a wait and see approach with their rosters, see how injuries play out. I don't know that the Steelers are one of these teams that are going to be, trading assets and draft picks to bring in an offensive lineman to bring in some OL help this year. But I think that if a guy that they have on their radar gets cut or gets cut on final cuts before week one, I think that the offensive line and left guard specifically is a move that they're going to keep a pretty close eye on depending on who's on the waiver wire.
And going back to the wide receivers really quickly, it obviously the Steelers, we talked about the rookies that they've drafted in George Pickens and, of course, Calvin Austin III. In the NFL draft this year, now that they've paid Johnson, it seems like maybe the writing is on the wall more for Chase Claypool's future in Pittsburgh. If the rookies shine this year, do you think Claypool is trade bait next year, or will they let him play out his rookie deal?
Yeah, I don't see that playing out that way, Allison. I talked to an executive in the AFC today, and he told me point blank, the Steelers will wind up re-signing him in a similar way to they re-signed Deontay Johnson. Because you look at Chase Claypool, you look at George Pickens, they're two different kinds of wide receiver. And, Claypool's one of these guys with the really reliable hands. He's really good after the catch. And Pickens is your big play, deep threat, burner, take the top off the defense type of a player. And there's a belief that those two not only can coexist, but as Kenny Pickett or whoever the young quarterback winds up being, having the more versatile wide receivers that you can get, the more that you can have of them, the better. So I think that there's a far more likelihood that Chase Claypool not only plays out his rookie deal, but ultimately re-signs on some sort of extension than the Steelers trading him or letting him walk.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe they will, with Omar Khan. Because as we discussed in the past, they've just gotten, the rookies have played out their contract and they went elsewhere. Maybe we're seeing sort of a new, maybe Omar Khan's putting his own stamp on things in terms of the wide receivers. So that's interesting.
And if you bring Claypool back, that opens you up to use resources in other areas. Maybe it's another draft pick that you can use along the offensive line that you wouldn't need, that you otherwise need to draft that future wide receiver. Or maybe you go and get a cornerback, or you go and get some additional linebacker help. I think that when you start to, again, the Steelers have an incredible track record of not overpaying at the position, which allows them to, keep payroll down and keep high-end talent because they develop talent at such a high level. But I think that if you can keep homegrown talent in place at that position, it allows you then to target other positions of need. And, Omar Khan, from his track record, he's done really well at building lines, really done a nice job along the front seven on defense. Those would be the kind of positions that I think you could see the Steelers really doubling down on in future drafts.
That would be smart for sure. And going to the running back position, Najee Harris had a big rookie season despite a patchwork offensive line, 1,667 yards total from scrimmage and 10 touchdowns with a league-high 381 touches. His 1,200 rushing yards were the third most. Do you see that trend continuing for Harris this season?
I do, because, we can talk all we want about the weapons, and we have Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Chase Claypool, Pat Fryermuth at tight end. If you have a young quarterback, whether it's Pickett or you have a journeyman like Mitchell Trubisky, their best friend is the running game. You look even with Josh Allen in Buffalo, dynamic running game. You look in Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts, a quarterback entering his third year. They made the postseason last year because of the fact that they led the NFL in rushing offense. So I think Najee Harris, I don't know that he can surpass the numbers that he had as a rookie year. I don't know that he's going to have more than 1,200 to 1,250 rushing yards, but I think he's a guy that's going to push for double-digit touchdowns. I think he's a guy who's consistently going to be above 1,000 yards because that's just the Pittsburgh way, right? When it does start to get cold, when it starts to get windy, when, teams are getting more physical late in the year, the games are bigger. That's when the Steelers' ground game really shines, and I think that he's going to be the beneficiary of that.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the Steelers have always been, the power run team, so it'll be good to see, what they can do with that this year. Obviously, you want to keep Najee Harris for as long as you can, with those fresh legs. But just the way it seems like Tomlin just wants to run the wheels off of him. So hopefully they'll get a second, an RB2 in there that can maybe be a little bit more consistent than maybe Benny Snell has been in the past and kind of spell him. But, Najee is a worker, man. Like, he wants to be on the field. He wants to have the ball in his hands as often as possible. So it's going to be interesting to see if they do lighten his workload this year or, how he's involved, maybe more in the passing game, things along those lines.
And who can blame him, right? I mean, if you're putting up that kind of production, you're coming from Alabama, where you've had that much success through your entire career, and you're in Pittsburgh, a city that loves old school, hard-nosed black and blue football. Why wouldn't you want to touch the ball 30 times per game, right? And I think that, you brought up a really interesting point there, Allison, that, you talk about the running back position, and you talk about running backs getting second contracts. The reason it doesn't happen is because guys break down and injuries happen. You look at Christian McCaffrey, you look at Saquon Barkley, to a little bit of a lesser extent, Alvin Kamara. There are real questions about the longevity of the position. But if you're the Steelers, I don't think that you can think like that because you're trying to get the most out of and develop potentially a young quarterback. You're trying to stay competitive in a division where you can, make a case there are 2, maybe 3 Super Bowl contenders you're competing with every single week, twice each per season. And if your strength is the ground game and you have a weapon like Najee Harris, unfortunately, you kind of have to run him into the ground and see what happens on the other side. And you can always find running backs. Teams do it all the time in the middle rounds of the draft.
Right, no doubt. And Mike Tomlin, as most coaches are, he's all about the present. He's all about this day, this game, not looking forward, to years down the road. So it makes sense that he just wants to use, Najee as often as possible.
Oh, no doubt. And this is an interesting situation for Mike Tomlin too, right? Because the last time that they were under 500 was 2010, somewhere around that range. It was, almost or more than a decade ago. This isn't a rebuild by any stretch for the Steelers, I don't think, but I think they're closer to having to rebuild and add young talent than they are a team that you can say is going to win 12, 13 games and compete for a Super Bowl. So, for him, you want to talk about reasons to play the young quarterback. The sooner you get Kenny Pickett in there, the sooner that you restart the clock on however warm your seat might be getting underneath you. And that's not me saying that Mike Tomlin is on any sort of hot seat, but I think that after the way the last couple of years have ended in Pittsburgh, I don't think that they are the class of the division and the class of the AFC as they once were.
Right. Actually, you'd have to go back to 2003, I believe, Bill Cowher.
Yeah, right.
When they were before, because they're saying, obviously, Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season. That actually dates back to, I believe, Cowher's last season. So it's been quite some time, and it's a really remarkable. Although Tomlin haters tend to say, oh, you're winning all these games, but you're not winning any meaningful playoff games. So, but still, it's like, you look around the league, and it's a remarkable feat, to be able to win as many games as he has, and it's just, I'm impressed.
As you should be, right? And eventually he's going to be a Hall of Famer because of, the fact that he's never had a losing season to date. He has the Super Bowl rings. So, obviously I think that that's where Mike Tomlin resides. It's just a matter of this year being a little bit different than what Pittsburgh has become accustomed to. Potentially.
Right, yeah, no doubt. So now going over to the opposite side of the ball with the defense, they've been inconsistent these past couple of years, especially versus the run and in the secondary. With changes in defensive coordinator and bringing in Brian Flores, do you see Pittsburgh turning it around and finishing in the top 10, maybe top 5 this season?
Brian Flores is certainly going to bring an attitude. I think that he's certainly going to have his guys fired up, especially after everything that he went through personally over the last 6 to 8 months or so. So I think this is going to be a Pittsburgh team that has a lot of attitude, especially up front. Anytime you have TJ Watt, anchoring that front seven, I mean, you're talking about a guy who is going to be in the conversation for Defensive Player of the Year every year. And you look at, Miles Jack behind him, a guy who I think still has a lot of really good football in front of him. I think going from 29th or 30th, last in the league, whatever they were in rushing defense, to top 10 might be a little bit of a stretch, but they're going to be better. And I think that it's going to look much more like the type of Steelers defense that people in Pittsburgh have become accustomed to over the last 2 decades.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Steelers have always been about the run game and defense. So if they can get that going and kind of help whoever's at quarterback along, I think they have a pretty good shot. And hopefully maybe even a wild card. You never know, I guess, right? You got to remain hopeful.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what happens in the AFC West, right? Because I think that all 4 of those teams, I can make a strong argument. Not only are they potential playoff teams, but maybe even Super Bowl contenders. But they're going to beat each other up. So it all comes down to how many teams in the AFC West, in my opinion, wind up winning 11, 12, 13, 14 games. And can the Steelers put it together and win 10 or 11, even if they don't win the division? If everybody else on that side in that division is won like 8 or 9 because they've beaten each other up, there might be a window there.
Right, yeah, no doubt. So now one of the most watched camp battles, aside from quarterback, of course, is it inside linebacker. Reports from camp say that Devin Bush still doesn't seem to trust his knee. How vital is it that Bush bounces back after a rough return from a 2020 ACL injury?
I think it's huge. I mean, you look at that position, especially, the quick cuts and the pivots that you have to do when you're reading a quarterback or dropping into coverage. It's huge for him. And, Devin Bush, he's a guy that you would think at one point in time was a top 8 or top 10 player at his position. And he's one of the more vital players in that front seven for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So in a lot of ways, I think that this defense is going to go as far as guys like Devin Bush, TJ Watt, and Micah Fitzpatrick can take them. So this is vitally important that he gets back on his feet and gets back to playing at the level he was before the injury.
Yeah. So big news this week was that the Bears' 5th-year inside linebacker Roquan Smith has requested a trade. Bears GM Ryan Poles quickly responded saying that they're going to get him paid. There's no doubts the teams were lighting up Poles' phone, inquiring about a trade. Were the Steelers one of them, and what might a trade for Smith look like?
Yeah, I would think that there would be 31 teams picking up the phone and calling Roquan Smith, right? But, I don't have any reporting or insight on whether or not the Steelers actually picked up the phone or if there was any sort of offer made. But you look at Roquan Smith, prime of his career, top 5 linebacker, top 5 inside linebacker, in my opinion, really disruptive, a guy who can push double-digit sacks from the inside linebacker spot. If you're talking about that type of a player, I think that, it'd be hard to pry him away for anything less than a second-round pick. So, if that's what the Steelers are all about, and they think that he's a guy that opens their window to compete for the postseason and compete for Super Bowls for the next 2, 3, 4 years down the line, then they should absolutely pull the trigger and make that deal. But here's where the quarterback uncertainty really hurts you, because not only did you overpay a little bit for Mitchell Trubisky, so you don't have the luxury of having Kenny Pickett on his rookie deal and that 4-year window to build around him, you don't know that you're going to need draft picks to move up and draft a quarterback next year or trade for a veteran quarterback next offseason because you aren't sold on Kenny Pickett and because Mitchell Trubisky is what he is or what he was in Chicago. So I think that's where the Steelers are kind of flat-footed here, and they're kind of caught in the middle between really doubling down and going for it and building out and getting Roquan Smith and kind of having to look at this year as an evaluation year for the quarterback position and then readdressing their needs for how to move forward with whoever the quarterback is this offseason.
Right. So kind of going back to what you said earlier, the Steelers and probably many other teams are kind of waiting for roster cuts, to make any more moves. But if Bush continues to struggle, do you see the Steelers potentially making another move for somebody to pair up with Miles Jack, whether it's Smith or otherwise? Or do you think they'll just hold their breath and hope for the best as the regular season starts?
No, I think this time of year, Allison, teams are always cycling through the bottom third of their roster, right? They're looking at their depth chart and they're thinking, okay, is player X on the waiver wire better than player Y who's on our roster? And linebacker is certainly one of those areas where I think the Steelers are a little bit thin. So I could certainly see if someone gets cut, someone clears waivers, what have you, I could see that being a position where they pence.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool, man. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope, maybe we'll do this a few more times this season.
I really enjoyed it, and I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
Heck yeah.